Ms Gardner.
Thank you, my lady. May I please call Dr. Beverly Yanjo?
If you'd like to repeat after me, I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down.
Dr. Yanjo, you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry. That is INQ 000562340. It runs to 76 pages and it is signed and dated the 31st of January 2024. But I believe that is a typo. Is that correct?
Yes, it should be 2025.
Thank you. Is the witness statement otherwise true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Yanjo, it would be useful to hear a little bit about your experience before the relevant period. So you're a procurement director with about 24 years of experience. I believe before you were in government, that was with a procurement consulting firm.
So 20 years experience in procurement before COVID, the pandemic, so 24, 25 now. 15 years in consulting and 5 years before that in corporate, sort of large corporate organisations.
And when did you join government and in what capacity?
So I joined in September 2019, the complex transaction team, which I believe, my lady, you've met some of my colleagues who have also worked on the pandemic. So I joined as a commercial specialist, which is a deputy director in the complex transaction team. And the role of the complex transaction team is about 50, it was around 50 people. It's a bit like an internal consultancy of specialists. So we work on the most complex, challenging, risky commercial problems that are occurring across governments. We'd work in different government departments. So I'd been in the organisation 5 months before I was deployed in DHSE to support setting up COVID testing.
Thank you, and we'll get to that those events very shortly. I believe you're now a commercial director in the FCDO. Is that right?
Yes.
And what is your PhD in?
Cell biology. So I was sponsored by GSK and Medical Research Council.
So did that scientific background, was that useful when you were doing your commercial work during the pandemic as well?
It was very useful. I suppose it's quite an unusual skill set, being sort of a cell biologist and a commercial specialist, but it was very useful at the time.
And that wouldn't be standard, we understand, for the sort of consultants within the CTT to have a scientific background.
There's a few people with maybe science degrees, but probably not to the sort of postdoctorate kind of level. But actually, it's got quite a real varied mix of people with different backgrounds. Most of us have come from the private sector.
So moving now to the pandemic, you've explained the role of the complex transactions unit, and it would be useful to hear about when you initially got involved in the coronavirus response. When was that?
So it was on the 18th of March 2020, and my line manager at the time, Jeanette Gibbs, who was the sort of, she was the interim director for complex transactions. She asked me to attend a meeting at DHSE. I think the request had come from Lord Bethell. I think it had gone to Minister Gove at the time, and then it sort of gone to Gareth Rhys-Williams. But they said they needed some commercial support, so I was sent along to that meeting.
And was it only you at that point?
It was only me.
Mm-hmm. And that meeting was on the 18th of March, as you've said. What was the substance of that meeting?
So it was a mixture of, so Lord Bethell was there, who's the Minister of Innovation at the time, and a number of colleagues from Office for Life Sciences. There was also Professor John Bell, and there was a couple of suppliers as well who operate in PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction. We'll come on to that later. But so that was Randox and Thermo Fisher. That was generally the sort of makeup of the individuals in that room. And the crux of the conversation was that we were in really dire straits. We had really limited capacity of PCR testing, which was the standard test, diagnostic test for viruses. The capacity, I think, across the whole of the NHS and PHE, so Public Health England, was really about 3,000 tests per day. And I remember Professor Bell had said, we need to get to the hundreds of thousands, we need to get to 100,000, and we need to do it really quickly. In days, he said we need to get capacity set up, so that was kind of the main focus of the meeting of that day.
It might be helpful to look at INQ 000535738. This is an email dated the 18th of March. I believe that this was sent directly following the meeting that you're referring to.
Yes, so this was almost a bit of a readout of that meeting that we'd had. There's another document which I think is in the exhibit. So there was a meeting the day before, on the 17th, before I joined. I know Professor Bell was at that, and a few other of the colleagues who were at this meeting.
We will come to that document as well.
So yeah,
later.
this was the readout, and it basically explained the work strands and who was responsible for each area.
That's great. And can we zoom out again on that email? And we can just see down the middle column of that table some of the attendees, some of the people involved in the implementation of what was agreed that day, including, as you say, representations from industry and also experts in that area.
Can I just say they weren't all in that meeting as well? So some of them were, so Kaijen, for example, weren't in the meeting. Jeremy Farrell wasn't in the meeting. So not everyone was in that specific meeting that I joined, but they were sort of assigned actions.
And if we go on to
After
the
that.
next page of that email. Thank you. And we see you're down to lead on the commercial aspects. And as you've said, it was only you at that point.
Yes.
At what point were you able to bring other people onto the commercial aspect of the testing program?
The next day, I brought some more people in from the complex transaction team.
And was there any pre-existing commercial capacity that you could draw on?
So DHSC did have a small commercial team, but DHSC is more of a sort of policy function, the commercial policy function. So any procurements they did tended to be more around the lines of specialist kind of technical expertise or policy expertise. So they weren't used to procuring, they didn't need to procure on a large scale, so they didn't really have much of a team. So that's why we had to bring people in from complex transactions, and we broadened that out to other government departments. But they were all people from government commercial function. But there were some individuals in the commercial team who we worked with quite closely. So it started off with Ed James, but then he moved into PPE, and then Lucy Mason, who was also a deputy director in DHSC, she also formed part of our team as well.
And what about PHE? They were the organisation within government who was responsible for protecting the public from infectious disease. What kind of commercial capability did they have at that point?
So they did have a commercial team. I engaged, I don't know if I'm allowed to name, but there was an individual there who headed up a team, and he joined as part of our team. And he had a team of individuals who'd set up the PHE microbiology framework. So he sort of joined us when I sort of pulled a team together. He sort of became part of it. And I supported him in going out for a new framework as well, because we knew the one that we had, it wasn't substantial enough to be able to fulfill the procurements that we needed to do.
But that existing commercial capacity within PHE by itself wouldn't have been sufficient to?
No, it was very small, and they had the framework, but I don't think they had quite a small capacity, so I don't think they could have really done much more than they were already doing.
Just to understand a bit more about the context in which you were operating when you first got involved, 18th of March, you've said in your witness statement that there were certain aspects of the nature of the testing that made it difficult to scale. So we're talking specifically about PCR tests at this point. What were those characteristics?
So, I don't know if you've sort of ever been in a laboratory, but my PhD was a lab-based PhD, so I was in the laboratory for 3 years. I also spent time in GSK's laboratory during my PhD. A lot of we're talking specifically about PCR. It's used in universities, NHS laboratories. It's a machine. It has to, you need a qualified, skilled professional to operate the machines. One test could have a bill of materials of around 50 items. So if you don't have all 50 of those items, you can't run a test. So when we talk about LFT, so lateral flow tests, and PCR tests, they're so different because, the process involved, it's someone in a laboratory pipetting things into a dish and then putting it in a machine. And we've moved on a bit from them as we scaled it up. But actually scaling up something like that is really challenging because you've got to have the right personnel, every last item that you need to make that test happen. And then you've got the sort of front end element as well of collecting samples, getting it to the laboratory, and there's a time frame that you have to get it there, otherwise it degrades and then you won't be able to test the sample. So it was a real sort of long, complex process, and it was never designed to be scaled up to the hundreds of thousands. And that's what made it really challenging as well as the global demand and the global shortage in requiring all those different products.
And it's helpful to have that insight into some of the logistical challenges in terms of transport of samples, but as well with the supplies, the reagents, the consumables that are required for each test. Were some of those, were they generic or were they brand specific? Were they required for other healthcare consumables during the pandemic? How was that affected?
So it's a really good question. So a lot of the systems, so the PCR platforms we were using were closed platforms, and this is quite common in the health sector. So I used to buy for Bupa as well as NHS organisations, so I've bought quite a lot in that sector as a procurement professional. And we'd done the same in PCR, and that a lot of the solutions were closed platforms. And what that means is you've got to machine, you can only use the branded consumables designed for that machine. You can't just use an alternative generic option. And that made it very difficult for us because we were so reliant on such a small number of platforms. And these were all large global suppliers where everyone in the world was wanting the same thing. And even though we had arrangements with them and we asked for more volume, most of them said, well, we are looking globally and we will give volume allocated by population across a whole customer base. So we had platforms in the NHS where we had the platform, but we could not get the reagents to operate that equipment. So that was a real challenge. And that's one of the reasons we were very limited in the NHS network to be able to build the capacity beyond a certain point.
And is that something that you were able to influence going forward as testing technology developed in terms of procurement?
So this is one of the reasons why we tried to diversify as well in some of the different providers. I'm talking just very specifically about PCR at the moment rather than alternative testing technologies. But for example, later on, we brought on PerkinElmer, which had been a very low volume PCR provider, and not one we were really using. So, because we were careful as well, we didn't want to sort of take volume where it was maybe needed elsewhere, because when we had the NHS labs and the Lighthouse labs, we didn't want to cannibalise the supply. So that's when we would try and diversify the different PCR platforms that we were using.
Thank you. I want to get on to the use of Lighthouse Labs now, actually, and you've mentioned the meeting that took place before the meeting that you attended on the 18th, on the 17th. I just want to get up the document that was produced at that meeting. It's INQ 000555915 and page 1. This says that it's the output from the Downing Street testing workshop. You weren't at this meeting, is that right?
Yes, I wasn't there.
Do you know who produced this document?
I think Lord Bethel was there. I think Professor John Bell was there. I think Krista MacLeod was there as well. I'm not sure who else. Maybe Cathy Hall, but I'm not certain, because obviously I wasn't there. But I did receive this readout when I joined on the 18th.
And we can see the initial target there has been set as increasing the NHS lab-based testing capacity, that's existing capacity within the NHS, from 5,000 a day to 25,000 per day. And on the next page, we see the other prongs of the four-pronged approach. Urgent and specific antigen testing for protecting frontline staff and maximising our workforce. Mass market testing for ordinary people using pregnancy test-style pinprick blood tests. And extending our national mass population surveillance. I'm not going to address surveillance testing with you today. You've set out in your witness statement that that's not something you were particularly involved in. But I do want to specifically address the scaling up of mass testing, because that was the key aspect of what was happening in the period of time when you were involved. You describe in your witness statement that there were 5 pillars that grew out of those work streams that we've just looked at. And I want to get another document up, which is INQ 000535762 and page 1. And just paragraph 1 there sets out a very quick summary of those 5 pillars. You've already explained pillar 1 to us in terms of the existing capacity. And what you say in your witness statement about that pillar is that it was clear within days that pillar 2, i.e. the creation of new testing facilities, was how the demand for capacity was going to be fulfilled. Why do you say that?
So I didn't actually fully answer your first point, but it comes back to the NHS. So even though the theoretical capacity was around 5,000, they were actually doing more like 2,000, 3,000 tests a day, and that included PHE as well. You've got, I think it's about 185 laboratories, so distributed across the UK. You have if I think of the sort of NHS England, so you've got, I think it was 185, then they're broken down into sort of 29 regions, but they're quite disparate and operating in isolation. And as you mentioned earlier, were the testing for other things, they were using PCR to test other diseases. So that capacity, whatever they had in the laboratories, wasn't just, they couldn't just ring fence that only for COVID. We did actually switch from testing to COVID to increase capacity, which I can come on to later. But we knew that with a network of that many laboratories, to really scale up without putting pressure on the NHS, it was just not going to be feasible. And also because of their platforms that they had were quite restrictive for all the reasons I've just mentioned. We needed new capacity, we needed additional machines, we needed additional personnel and additional supplies, and we could only do that in new laboratories because they've got a footprint in the NHS labs that you couldn't just extend because they're in hospitals, the pathology labs based in hospitals.
So I want to go to INQ 000561740. This is a slide deck from which is entitled Workstream 2, which is the precursor to Pillar 2, commercial overview. And this is from the middle of April, so this is a month later. But it gives us an insight into what was required for this scaling up of testing through the private sector. We can see on the right-hand side there the kind of things you were procuring. And it's not just consumables, it's not just testing, and it's also not just labs, because you are procuring physical testing sites, which many of us have been to ourselves in the course of the pandemic, and you're also procuring a huge logistics operation. You've explained some of the complexities of that. We can also see some of the organisations involved named on this, and were these organisations, how were they brought into the system?
So in the very early days, we were talking to as many organisations as possible who had capability, and I think it's probably different to maybe some of the other areas like PPE, where actually most of the organisations we dealt with were well-established organisations, because when you're delivering solutions like PCR and the reagents, there's a lot of controls and quality controls and a lot of investment in producing these kind of consumables and reagents. Randox, Thermo Fisher, a lot of these organisations were already either on frameworks, not necessarily that we could always use them, which I'm sure you'll come on to later. But we had sort of the PHE microbiology framework. We had the suppliers who we knew were already working in the NHS. So Thermo Fisher was well established. Amazon's obviously a huge logistics provider. There was a number of organisations who had just said, what can we do to help? Randox had a lab that was already up and running. It was quite small scale, but actually they had an accredited process for running COVID testing. So, and the first Lighthouse lab, UK Biocentre, happened to be a working lab that was basically about to close because it couldn't sustain funding.
And could you just explain what you mean by Lighthouse lab? Because
So I'm not really sure why we called them Lighthouse labs, to be honest. I can't remember. But it was deemed as a sort of a lab that would be high throughput outside of the NHS system, run by the commercial sector to deliver to increase the capacity. So the first one was in Milton Keynes, and it was the UK Biocentre, and it was John Bell who knew that that lab was operating but about to not operate anymore.
And is that shown on this slide, Milton Keynes?
Yes. Yeah. So it was the very first one, and sort of Manchester and Scotland came soon after. So they were basically set up so that was already operating. So it was quite serendipitous that it was about to close, but it had staff and they had PCR machines, and that's why that was the first lab. And I was involved in negotiation. Tim Byford, who was one of my colleagues, I got him to lead on this work stream. So my job was more overarching, looking across all the work streams, so oversight of all the commercial procurements we did. And then I put colleagues in each of the work streams. But yes, that's how we sort of engaged with Thermo Fisher. Amazon, I think, had volunteered to offer some logistic support. They said they didn't want to do it long term, but they had an infrastructure already in place. But a lot of these names changed quite soon after as we sort of put new contracts in place.
Yeah, thank you. So we can take that one down now, but could we have back our summary of the 5 pillars at INQ 000535762 and paragraph 1? Thank you. We've looked at paragraph 1, at pillar 1, we've looked at pillar 2. Pillar 3, I just want to touch on briefly. Development of antibody tests that can be proven to work. Are we led to believe by this that at this point there were not antibody tests that can be proven to work?
So in parallel, we had been buying antibody tests, which very early on in the pandemic, there was a view that if people had antibodies, it might mean they've been exposed to it and it gives them some immunity. The scientific view quite not long after was that it actually probably wasn't going to help us that much. But at the time, it was seen as a way of testing people, seeing if they had immunity, and that might mean people can go to work. We had bought a significant number of antibody tests. Most of them, when we tried to validate them, they weren't suitable.
So you had bought them prior to them being validated?
Yes, we took that sort of high risk decision, and this was very early. This was probably the first few days I was there, and it was the Secretary of State. I was in a meeting with him and others. We'd have these sort of daily updates. We were still in the office at that time, so not working from home. And other nations were buying up all these tests. Most of them came from China. They wouldn't actually send us samples, so we couldn't pre-validate because they were just saying, we're so busy, we're not sending you samples. So we were authorised to spend up to £100 million on these tests. Pam Doyle, who's another colleague of mine, led this work stream. We bought a lot of the tests. We tested them. They weren't validated, and we recouped most of the costs. We kept a small amount for the surveillance studies, but most of them we cancelled the contracts, and we didn't take up the orders for those. And that's why at this point we need one that's proven to work. So you'll see in my evidence, that's when we went into the development of a test of our own with a consortia called Abingdon Health.
Thank you. I've already mentioned that we're not going to cover surveillance testing in detail, but we will look at Pillar 5, which is set out here as building a British diagnostics industry at scale. This document is from April, and it is explaining the launch of Pillar 5, this national diagnostics effort. Why was that seen as necessary at that point?
Because we had so many limitations on supply. So as I've pointed out, a lot of the closed platforms we had, we just couldn't get any more supply, so that effectively makes them redundant. We had looked into seeing if we could open up the platforms and obtain approval from the organisations to try more generic reagents to see if they'd work with them, but that didn't really go anywhere. So what we used this for was to, one, understand if there was other suppliers out there who could supply different PCR platforms or the reagents and consumables that go with them. So coming back to my point earlier, it wasn't just sort of what you needed in the laboratory. We were really short on swabs. So you probably remember the swabs that used to put up your nose or in your throat at the time. You had viral transfer media, you had the test tubes that you put the viral transfer media in, and then the swab. So there's a lot of things where we had shortages of, and if there's a break in that chain, if any of those things are missing, you cannot run a test. You could have a full lab working, but if you don't have the swabs to collect the samples, then you can't run tests. So we used it to sort of open up the life science industry. So I think that first call we had, which I joined Lord Bethel, the Secretary of State, and I sort of listed the key areas where we had real shortages, and it was to basically ask the life science industry, does anyone have capability and capacity to provide these products, these items? I would add as well that there was a lot of goodwill as well. We had GSK, AstraZeneca opened up their supply chain, so they put us in touch with their own supply chains. And, so we gained a lot of contacts through that route as well. But yeah, we knew we needed more, and also we were interested in potential alternative testing solutions.
So you've mentioned some aspects of this already, but in terms of your engagement with experts and industry in the life sciences sector, how did you go about doing that in mid-April 2020?
So we had... So we did the call out. So I think that first session where there's 500.
It was at the industry webinar on the 8th of April.
Yes. So prior to that, what we used was what was actually very helpful. So we had a few frameworks. There was some of the NHS frameworks and the PhD microbiology framework. And what they were really useful for is actually telling us which suppliers were operating this market. So I don't know if you'll come on to frameworks. There was a challenge using that framework, unfortunately, because of the regulation we were operating under. But what it was helpful is, a lot of the suppliers were on that framework, and even though we couldn't necessarily use the framework always to award contracts, we knew who the main suppliers were in this sector.
So that's a proactive approach.
Yeah, that's what we did. So we contacted them and understood what capacity they had. Some of them had other solutions they were developing as well. So that really opened up our conversations. So myself and my team, we were really proactive in talking to those suppliers. And that's why actually some of the solutions were introduced because of those quite proactive conversations of having that sort of really positive starting point of these frameworks that we could refer to.
And then did suppliers also approach you?
So So I think there was some legacy inboxes where there was kind of offers coming through, to DHSC. Also Bays, they were sometimes referring. People did start contacting me, although we had a sort of mailbox. People did contact me directly after we did that webinar as well. So yes, people did contact me and my colleagues directly.
Can we have up INQ 000551339 at page 7? Thank you. This is a WhatsApp chain which I know you've seen, but you weren't on at the time, and that's been provided to the inquiry. It's a WhatsApp group entitled HSC Support Group, and this is a message from James Bethel sent on the 17th of April. And the WhatsApp chain involves a variety of people, including other senior politicians, MPs, and some civil servants. He references here the kind of call to arms that you've described, where this call to British industry has been put out. And he says, we have received 5,000 inquiries in the last 2 weeks from companies. They have a huge team. They've engaged many, but many companies are offering tests which are not relevant for our battle plan. And he links the battle plan there. That might be a typo, but he says many of them do not meet our standards. I appreciate many are frustrated, but we do have high standards and it is reasonable to apply these to protect the people. He gives some more details of that and then says at the bottom, this is a difficult message to deliver. We are not closed to new ideas, but we are drowning in helpful suggestions, while at the same time being very focused about delivering some tough deliverables. If there are any standout companies that you really think we're missing, please do email me and I have a fast track process. But please be aware there might be strong clinical or practical reasons why we cannot take up every offer for help. First of all, we've heard in this inquiry already about other calls to arms in relation to PPE and ventilators and the impact that that has had on procurement teams in terms of having a huge number of offers to deal with. He says here that we are drowning in helpful suggestions. Was that your experience at the time?
Yes, I would say so. So what I would say is, so BSA, the Business Service Authority for the NHS, so they were handling a lot of the sort of inbounds, and there was a web form that people could fill in, which I think we publicised on that call to arms event we had. But it was a really challenging period, and I would like to give a bit of context here as well. So you've heard how in the PPE cell there was 500 buyers. Between March and August, there was 25 to 30 of us at any one time doing all the commercial work. And, you know, it was unsustainable and really difficult, long hours. I was in there for 9 months working those kind of hours. And it was great that people were coming forward, but I think the challenge we had, it is so technical. And there's it's not like it's a product that if it's got a stamp, you can use it. It has to be technically compatible with the platforms we have. You have to have every single item for it to function. You know, you need the RNA extraction reagents, you need the PCR agents, you need the pipette tips. So we were getting inundated with a lot of things that we just didn't need or they weren't suitable. I think we had a really good process. We had a lot of technical people. So we had the technical advisory group and the viral test advisory group, and I sat on that as well. But I think we were sort of very robust. But when we were having this kind of volume coming through, it was difficult. Sometimes it was coming to our inboxes as well. I mean, I think I was averaging 200 emails a day. I didn't have any support with my inbox till the autumn of 2020. So yeah, there was a huge volume. So we became a lot more targeted. So we would say we are only interested in RNA extraction, or we're only interested in antibody LFTs. And then we started to, that's how we would then prioritise what we were looking for, where the shortages were. And we wouldn't necessarily always discard something forever, but there was no point looking at swabs, for example, if we'd secured enough swabs. So that's kind of what we needed to do, but it was hard.
And did that adapted approach of putting out perhaps more specific calls to arms about, say, we only want RNA extraction at the moment, did that produce more useful results and fewer of these overwhelming amounts of offers?
I think it did help, but even on that first call to arms on the 8th, I think it might be in my exhibits, even on that one, I did actually specifically say where we wanted support. So I think there was maybe 4 key areas that I said, you know, these are the items we need. This is what we're looking for.
Ultimately, do you think that call to arms was a good idea?
I do, actually, because I don't think we were engaged enough with the life science industry. And while we were already engaging with suppliers who we'd sort of proactively contacted through the frameworks, where, those we knew were operating in this sector, I think it was really important because some suppliers might not have had something we needed right then, but a lot of, we'll probably come on to it, with the sort of different technologies that were being developed, it actually gave us an opportunity to talk to suppliers who were working on things that were quite innovative and different.
So perhaps if you had already had those industry contacts and been in a better position in terms of your contact with industry more widely, you wouldn't have needed to do that call to arms and would have been able to make more proactive approaches.
And I know that Professor John Bell said in his statement, so obviously he's a scientist and he's engaged a lot with industry. He said that there's just not enough of that sort of openness, and we need to be connected to particularly our domestic life science industry. We'd sort of, a lot of the supplies we were using were mainly based in the USA, and that was problematic as well because of the US Defense Act. That did impact us. We were over-reliant on, consumables and products from China as well. So actually, part of the sort of life science strategy he was working on was really looking at our domestic sector, and I don't think we were close enough to it, and we didn't have enough insight into what was available.
One more point on this message from Lord Bethell. He mentions that if there are any standout companies you really think we're missing, please do email me, gives his email address, and I have a fast-track process. Do you recognise the fast-track process he describes there?
We didn't have a fast-track process. What we had was we'd have like a consolidated database which we would triage from, and we would fast-track something if it was one of our priorities. We wouldn't fast-track it because it came from a certain individual. We'd fast-track it if it's something that we needed, and if it wasn't, then we wouldn't. So it was anything that was prioritised was purely based on technical need, or if we had a shortage of something and it offered an alternative.
If something had come into the process through contact who was a senior member of government or another politician, would it have been marked in any way, fast track priority?
It wasn't marked fast track or priority. We did mark them because, similar to the PPE cell, it was a distraction. We had loads of referrals from all across government, and not just the current government, but other MPs.
Sorry, how would you mark them?
We'd mark it as to who it came from, so that we could feed back. And we only did that. We did it for a short period, but again, there was a time where we were getting chased to feed back, and it was just distracting. And we were so busy. We were working like 18 hours a day, and trying to secure supplies to get to 100,000 in 6 weeks, and it was just distracting. What I would say is most of the chasing wasn't actually coming from the referrer in our case, it was coming from the supplier. And it was almost like sometimes the supplier who'd been referred felt that they should be prioritised because they felt that they had a connection. And whereas actually, I think a lot of the time it was referred, and the referrer wasn't chasing us as much as the supplier was. But either way, it was just distracting. So we would mark it, and then if they didn't pass validation, we could then just inform them and say, this hasn't gone anywhere. And we tried to sort of proactively manage it in that way. And
would you proactively inform a supplier that they hadn't passed validation if they hadn't come in via a...
Yeah, we would just do it anyway. So we had, and I think there's quite a few exhibits where we've got a spreadsheet. We had those where we would progress, some we would hold. and some we would reject, and often we'd have a reason for why they were rejected.
Thank you. We can have that off the screen now. I'd like to consider more generally the effect of the policy announcements and public announcements in particular on NHS test and trace procurement decisions, and the involvement of ministers in those procurement decisions. You've already told us that when you were brought on the 18th of March, the NHS's existing capacity was maybe said to be about 5,000, but in reality was about 2,000, 3,000. In the email we looked at earlier, it said that the initial target was about 100,000 tests per day by the end of April. Do you know how that target came about?
So I think on that document you showed earlier, which from the meeting on the 17th, it actually says 100,000. So it was already decided early on. I think from what I recall, I don't know if it was I think it might have come from SAGE, which is this sort of government scientific advisory group in emergencies. I think they had sort of done some sort of calculation as to if you were making sure you had enough capacity to test people with symptoms, frontline staff in hospitals, and other key workers, you would need 100,000 tests per day. I think that's where that sort of that target came from.
So that's based on a calculation of how many people might potentially get COVID and therefore
and infection
need
rate,
tests.
Yeah. I think at that early stage, obviously.
Yes, and you've also said that at that point you had only just been brought on. So does it follow that there was no commercial involvement in the setting of that target?
Yes, there's no commercial involvement.
So are you aware that in the setting of that target, anyone did any kind of checks into how feasible it would be to procure the tests necessary, or the testing capacity necessary to carry out that number of tests?
I doubt there would have been any feasibility done.
And when you were brought on and told this is the target and this is the deadline, did you feel it was a feasible target that you were going to be able to meet?
I mean, I'm an optimistic person, but I'll be honest, kind of knowing how PCR works, I wasn't sure we would be able to do it, in all honesty. It felt like a huge task, and it was, because it was taking it to a whole different scale than we were used to. But also, if you think about how it normally happens, people are in hospital, they're in the hospital, they take the sample, it gets sent to the lab. It was changing that whole dynamic. It was collecting samples from people all over the UK from hundreds of test centres, then the logistics of sending that to labs and directing it to where there was capacity. And I think this is why, I think I mentioned in my statement, I think by the end of April there was 20,000 people working in test and trace. Now, obviously, most of them were supplier, like they were in the laboratories and logistics and the test centres and, you know, where we all went to and got our swabs. But to stand that up in 6 weeks was quite incredible, really. But early on, I wasn't sure how we were going to do it because we just couldn't even get some of the most basic things.
You say in your witness statement that from about July of 2020, your experience was that number 10 in particular got more and more involved in decisions about testing, and that sometimes this would lead to contradictory decision making as between NHS Test and Trace and number 10. Can you give us an example of what you mean by that?
So just to give some context as well. So from the very beginning, I had contact with number 10. I worked quite closely with Will Waugh and James Phillips, who are both special advisors and Will War had convened those daily calls from the 18th. So there'd always been engagement. I think the reason they sort of intervened more from July onwards because it was relating to sort of mass testing. I think where it got a bit challenging at times was obviously Baroness Harding came in late May to set up and establish NHS Test and Trace. You know, at that point we weren't, you know, I just started the pilots for asymptomatic testing, so mass testing wasn't really even on the radar at that point. But I think what became challenging was there was a strong view on the back of the asymptomatic testing pilots that I'd sort of led on with LAMP, and we started getting more insight of what other countries were doing. I think that's where Number 10 at that point wanted to go for a real sort of nationwide mass testing approach, which was kind of at odds with the approach that we were, you know, the direction we were moving in test and trace, if you like. We'd sort of been focusing at that point on winter capacity and building up capacity for another wave. So I think that's where they intervened. You'll see from the sort of the large purchase of lateral flow tests that we did later on, which I think is in one of the exhibits.
Perhaps it's helpful to have a look at that, actually. Can we have up INQ 000561757? Thank you. If we can just have the next page. And actually, the last page of this document. So we have here an email. This is from the 2nd of October 2020. This is from James Phillips, who we can see has a Number 10 email address. And I think you say in your witness statement that he was an advisor, a special advisor in Number 10. He says that he is very concerned to hear that we have been leaving lateral flow tests unbought whilst we wait to identify the right amounts for each test. He says the stakes are very high. For tests that look half decent at port and down, which is where you carry out validation of tests, as I understand it, we should buy maximum as soon as possible. Any unnecessary delays longer than 3 hours, phone me. Any hour of the day, I'll give it my full attention. Maybe we have misunderstood, but it's just worth restating the risk appetite. He also goes on to say that America have set the precedent by buying literally all the Abbott tests, so people can't complain. It is, and he actually also refers further down that the tests referred to are the very ones that the Global Act Alliance just bought en masse. So is it right to say that at that point there was a huge amount of concern from Number 10 that if we didn't buy tests, they would be bought and there wouldn't be any left for the UK? If we can just go up one page. And here we have a reply to that email from Dominic Cummings. I think we're all aware of what his role was in Number 10. And he says, agree, buy. I cannot begin to describe the PM's reaction if we miss the chance to buy 200 million of these things because we're thinking about what to do with them, waiting for CST to sign a letter, etc. I'd like the deal done by close of play today and planes in the air ASAP to collect. In that second sentence, where he says we're thinking about what to do with them, waiting for CST to sign a letter, do you think that's a fair description of what the commercial team were doing at the time, or what the reasons for the hesitancy?
So, and I do need to give a little bit of context here. So this comes across as very dramatic in some ways, and it was a Friday, and I remember it very well. But the first thinking around sort of mass testing, actually, it was the end of April when we first got a sort of proposal in. And And then, so there'd been work looking at sort of asymptomatic testing and mass testing in the sort of months beyond that. I worked closely with Will Waugh and James Phillips, who are both special advisors, worked closely with Dominic Cummings. We were already looking at making a significant purchase of these lateral flow tests. We had already bought 40 million. We were doing further validation at Porton Down, and we were probably a week away from buying a more significant volume. So
I think you say in your statement 180 million.
Yeah, so it's, you know, and actually this was on the back of, there was a weekly meeting. I didn't attend this meeting, but there was a weekly meeting to talk about this. And after the meeting had finished, James Phillips had called me to say, I'm going to send you an email. We need to buy sooner.
And that's was that the email that we
yes, so that's what started. I do want to bring out something that is quite important, and I bring this out quite a lot in the statement. You know, we were already, I had two individuals negotiating with these suppliers, so we'd paid for 40 million, and we wanted to buy more, and we were trying to reduce the costs. So I do think this was the right decision to buy these tests, and we needed to buy them quickly, especially as I think the WHO are about to announce that it was a valid form of testing. So that would have immediately sent a global market sort of frenzy for them. But I think what was really challenging was we can't just spend over £1 billion in a day. You know, you can't just write a check and get aeroplanes in the sky at the end of the day. I'm the only civil servant on this email thread apart from Simon Case, who never got involved in the conversation. And, you know, actually we did push back and say, you're right, we do need to buy these, but I needed to do a business case. I needed to do a ministerial submission. And I did it all in that one day with the support of my team. And we concluded negotiations on this over the weekend, which saved £700 million. There's not been a lot of discussion around actually our interventions and actually where we did deliver value, often pushing back at number 10 and other senior individuals. But this was a real challenge for our commercial team, including myself, around the pressure we were under, but we still would push back and do the right thing. So I think this was the right decision to make. But often you would be on these threads and would get these direct instructions, and it just, you know, it just became, you know, cramming everything that you would normally do in months and years into literally one weekend.
Thank you. I want to look at another example that you reference in your statement. This is INQ 000561737 on page 6. So at the bottom, we have an email dated the 9th of April 2020 from Lord Feldman. He says, slightly irate Gordon on the phone. He had a meeting with Bev. We assume that's you.
Me.
Essentially, he says he has now sourced both test kit and extraction kits. If you can just go down. Thank you. We believe his tests work across a range of open PCR machines. He can deliver. Lord Feldman won't comment on price. I think important not to leave Gordon hanging after the work he's done. The gift of 100k units arrives tomorrow. And he ends, we should try to get this done if we can. Just so we can understand this email, who is Gordon and what deal does this relate to?
So Gordon is the CEO of Oxford Nanopore, and they had proposed to supply BGI branded. So BGI is a manufacturer in China of PCR test kits. So these are for processing in the laboratory. And they had proposed to sell us 3 million at a price with 100,000 on top gifted, which, you know, I had concerns about this deal for a number of reasons, but part of their offer was you buy 3 million, we give you 100,000 units.
You buy some and you get some free.
Yeah, which, yeah, kind of.
It's not a usual thing you encounter in public procurement.
Yeah, so it was known as a gift. We're not comfortable with gifts, but that was what the offer was. I had a number of problems with this.
Can we just look at the rest of the email,
Yeah,
and we'll
please
get
do.
to those. Can we go up one page? Sorry, another page. Thank you. So we can't see who this email is from, but it's from someone within NHS. They confirm some details about the tests, but they also say that they don't think that there has been an unacceptable delay. And then they say, based on discussions with Bev and the NHS labs, we propose asking for so many tests a month and not haggling on price. And you mention the use of that word haggling in your witness statement. Can you explain some of your response to that word?
I think it's a really dismissive term to use when we were just trying to responsibly spend public money. But I was coming under a lot of pressure not to challenge the price. And I thought the price was inappropriate, even in the current market of significant supply and demand issues. And I think you earlier spoke to Sarah Collins around benchmarking. Well, it was challenging to benchmark, my lady, because we had the framework which had pricing in. Obviously, that pricing was based on a business as usual environment where we don't have a supply demand. But actually, you can still extrapolate from that as to what is a reasonable uplift in cost when you've got a difficulty around supply and demand. And we'd also secured PCR tests from others. There was also someone on my team who'd done even further research. BGI were actually on the framework, the PHE framework. So we knew if we went to them directly how much we could secure that for. I can't go, for reasons I can't go into today, there was reasons why we couldn't buy direct from BGI. But the offer that they gave was, I felt it was unacceptable and unjustifiable, and that's why I challenged it. But I kept coming under pressure as to not to haggle.
And I believe that ultimately you recommended that you reduce the volume purchased.
And the price.
And the price. And was that recommendation accepted?
Yes, so Lord Bethel, it was escalated to Lord Bethel, and I shared with him the brilliant sort of detailed work that my colleague Anna had pulled together. And when he reflected on that, he said we wouldn't accept it at the price they were offering, so they reduced the price significantly. The reason I wasn't happy to buy 3 million of these tests was because the product, we only had a certain number of machines that were compatible with this test. And I was worried that if we bought 3 million, we wouldn't get through them all because they were a bit untested. The view was that they would work on more machines, but they hadn't been validated on more machines. So we reduced the volume to instead of 3 million. which was just as well, because I think we still lost. I don't think we used them all. I think there was around 100,000 that expired, so had to be disposed of.
And were there other examples where you ended up procuring or committing to volumes of tests that ultimately weren't needed?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, this was an example where, I was able to push back and we reduced the volume. But there were other situations where, I would challenge, but it's not really my decision to make at the end. And sometimes my advice was listened to and sometimes it wasn't. It was more challenging in the autumn of 2020 because this was when there was a bit, coming back to your earlier point, of friction. There was, Number 10 were keen on doing sort of nationwide mass testing, but this was changing quite a lot. So Test and Trace had some concerns around that.
I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to stop you. My lady, something has been said which we consider may breach a restriction order. Could I invite you please to pause the live feed while we address you more fully on the issue of concern so you can decide what steps to take, if any.
Pause the live feed, please.
I think we just need 1 minute. My lady, thank you. We are going to ask you for your permission to make a restriction order over the comment that Dr. Yanjol made over the quantity of tests procured, which was for reasons of commercial sensitivity.
Certainly. Easy mistake to make. Don't blame yourself.
Thank
Done.
you.
Feed up. On again, please.
Thank you. I might move on to one further instance of interaction between the centre of government and procurement of the testing equipment. We've talked at length about some of that friction that was there, and you and your colleagues' desire to stick by the principles of good procurement and preserve public money. But there were also examples where there was concern from senior figures in government that they were not being given enough time to make decisions about spending large quantities of money. And I want to look at INQ 000471020. And if we start page 3. Thank you. So we can see here an email from someone on behalf of Lord Agnew. And if we can look at that email, it notes that the Prime Minister has publicly committed to ramping up testing capacity. In reality, the maximum testing capacity that the market can currently provide is around half of the figure that's given. However, Dido Harding is not willing to engage with any challenge from Cabinet Office, not sure what experience you're having on the HMT side. From what I can see, it seems as though Gareth is asking sensible questions. And if we can zoom out, we can see that below, whoever this email is from has pasted some comments from Lord Agnew, and then below that some comments from the Government Chief Commercial Officer, Gareth Rhys-Williams, who you've set, as you said out in your witness statement, also relayed his concerns to you. And you're not in this email chain, but you have provided us in your witness statement with the other emails which indicate you were aware of these concerns. And you've also seen this email. So I just want to look at those comments from Lord Agnew. In particular, he says, as I'm sure you will agree, it is ridiculous to ask me to approve a $1.25 billion programme in one day. And he asks various questions, including, has CST been involved? When did you get it? And what challenge have you deployed? And then at the same time, if we can look one page down at the comments from the Government Chief Commercial Officer, Gareth Rhys-Williams. He also makes a number of comments, and we're not going to look at all of them, but his initial comments are, while I get that the political imperative is to set this up and fast, there are aspects I'm really not happy about. And in particular, he says, Rule 32, unforeseen, really, for 6 months, with a great deal of exclamation points. And DA, we take that to mean direct award. Why, what's wrong with the competition? Why didn't we start earlier? So, similar question to Lord Agnew. And if we can also look at a document which you've provided to the inquiry. So this is INQ 000535833. We can start at page 3. Thank you. This is a response that you drafted to particularly Gareth Rhys-Williams' questions. We see at question number 8, you're responding to Gareth Rhys-Williams' question about why not a direct award. And if we go down, you can see your response. You state that none of the current PCR providers are on the existing framework or able or willing to provide the volume. And you provide some more context for that. You say there's no suitable framework and that the quickest route to a competition is via suitable framework agreement, which would take 6 to 10 weeks. Not going in any further to the detail of what that framework would look like, can you expand on the questions that were asked about why these senior government figures were being asked to approve such a large spend in such a short period of time?
So it was unreasonable to ask them to approve it in 24 hours. And, so I completely understand their frustration. And I know that in my statements, I refer to another email where the Chief of Staff of Baroness Harding had spoken to, I think it was Kate Josephs, the Director General in the Cabinet Office, to say that there had been problems on our side in getting this submission together. And because there was delays on our side, it led to delays to get them to Cabinet Office. So I think it was unreasonable to ask for that turnaround time. I drafted the submission that went to the ministers, as well as worked with my colleagues who supported me, but drafted the sort of business case. It was really challenging because we were trying to maximise the capacity in the current lab footprint we had in the NHS, as well as in the current Lighthouse labs before we created new Lighthouse labs. And that was really onerous and difficult. It's hard to sort of track time there because one day felt like a week. It felt like it took a long time. I'm sure it was a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, the Prime Minister had announced we will get to 500,000 tests per day by that date. I think it was October. We had to do it, and we were already behind. So I think by the time we got this to Cabinet Office, we were under immense pressure because this was expanding current capacity across the NHS, the current Lighthouse labs, and adding some additional ones, and that takes time. I actually think all the questions were valid, and it's quite hard when you were in there and you've got real knowledge of the detail to sort of reflect and grasp the fact that actually this looks probably quite odd to those who aren't as close to it. And, you know, in hindsight, a lot of these questions I should have preempted and just put them in the original case, so they didn't actually have to ask them. But I was so into the detail of it, and frankly under a lot of pressure, because this was just one thing of many other things that I was looking at the time. But my view is there were valid questions. Unfortunately, this is just a draft. I couldn't find in my archive the final version. That's why there's some gaps.
But some version of this went
But
to
a version did go back
Williams.
to them, answering all their questions, and we did obtain sort of approval on the back.
Thank you.
That.
I have one further question for you. It's something that you've touched on but not directly addressed. We know from your statement that because of the limitations on commercial capacity that was pre-existing, a large number of private consultants were brought on to assist you in the commercial operation. You have given us a great amount of detail, which I'm not asking you to repeat in your witness statement, about the implications of that. But one comment that you made is that there was a lack of understanding of our role, with many seeing commercial as rubber stampers. And you also say that there was at times a cavalier attitude to the value of money. Can you just briefly explain what you mean by that?
I think it's worth referring to Baroness Harding's statement, because I think she set it out very clearly. The direction she'd been given from the Prime Minister was scale up, test and trace, and scaling up at speed has to be the priority. The quality element is non-negotiable, and because, you know, I've reiterated a lot in this session, technical compatibility, all those things, that sort of makes that aspect of it quite simple, because it's either compliant and able to be used or not. Then the third point is value for money, and it was very clear that that is secondary to the other two, and particularly speed and scale. While I agree with that principle, it didn't, you know, from the perspective of me and my team, we were still very much focused on value for money. And we would challenge, but it was really hard because we were constantly sort of coming up against this view of, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? You just need to write a contract. You just need to sign a contract. And I think for us to just do our job, it felt like we had to have really thick skins, and that just doesn't feel right, that for such an extended period we were constantly battling to do the right thing. So yes, speed was definitely a number one priority, but you can still do that in a responsible way. But there was this view of just, well, we just have to spend. It doesn't matter, whatever it costs, this is what we have to do. And, you know, I've detailed my statement, but the team of 25 to 30 people, you know, we either avoided cost or actual cashable savings of £1.5 billion of public money. But that was quite hard to do, because that meant pushing back and pushing back. But I can genuinely say we didn't once delay something critical happening by trying to drive that value for money. And you have to do it when there's no competition. And there was no competition, because we had to buy everything that we could use from everyone, and then you have to use a different form of leverage. But it did make it very difficult.
Thank you. My lady, those are all of my questions. I believe there are some from
Thank you very much. Just a few more questions for you. Mr. Dale, who's over there.
Thank you, my lady. Dr. Yanjo, I ask questions on behalf of FEMO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organizations. you had significant involvement in the procurement processes during the pandemic, particularly for NHS test and trace services. And so I will ask for your reflection on a few topics of interest for FEMO. Firstly, to what extent was the procurement of NHS test and trace services tailored to meet the needs of those serving minority ethnic communities?
Thank you for the question. So I think our approach was always to increase access as much as we possibly could. So that meant reaching rural areas, making sure we had enough coverage in, more dense populated areas as well. So I can't answer specifically about did we have an approach geared towards ethnic minorities in isolation, but what we did take into account was we needed to be able to have home kits so people could actually send samples and test at home and post it, and also enough centres across the UK that were accessible for everybody to get to. Is that sort of answered your question, or do you want me to add more to that?
Well, that spoke more to geography. I was thinking more in terms of minority ethnic communities or race or ethnicity. But if that's as far as you can go, that's fine.
I think it was just as much access as we could to everybody. I mean, one of the areas that I'd sort of worked quite closely on was the sort of portable testing as well. It moved into sort of more community testing from mass testing, but again, getting more devices out into different communities so that they were more accessible, but it was more just having as much access as possible across the nation, but not specifically directed at ethnic minorities.
Very well. And next question. Were independent or ethnic minority-led healthcare providers consulted in the development and implementation of NHS test and trace contracts?
So we talked to a lot of organisations, and there was nothing recorded as to whether they were minority ethnic-led organisations. And we were very proactive in talking to lots of organisations and the type of organisations that had struggled, frankly, in the past to work with the NHS and PHE, often small organisations who struggled. There was too many barriers to sort of get on frameworks. But no, we didn't deliberately target those that were led by ethnic minority or, leading those organisations. But we tried to speak to as many organisations as we could, and often those that would normally maybe not have access to government contracts. I would like to also refer to the database that was shared with me from the Rockefeller Foundation, which had 1,500 suppliers on there. That was geared more towards mass testing, but that was the starting point for our triage process when we were looking at solutions. So it was really about casting the net wide and looking at different types of organisations, and particularly in the domestic market as well, we were keen to look at.
All right. And I suppose in light of what you said about the absence of a record around ethnicity, I'm wondering whether you can say anything about how their input might have influenced the final service provision. Are you in a position to say? I suppose it would be fine in the absence of the record that we were talking about, or you were talking about.
I can't say we we did that. What I would say though is I think actually more engagement with the public in general around, particularly when we look at mass testing. Mass testing is only beneficial if people then act on the result of that test. And I know that when we did the pilot, first asymptomatic pilot in the Southampton area, we had sort of selected people at random, and we'd got some really interesting feedback on behaviours and some people's views about testing, which I think would have been really good to explore more detail, because it explored the behaviours and maybe some concerns or misconceptions that people had. So I think if we'd expanded on that, it would have been quite useful, and probably looked into sort of making sure we had enough coverage across different demographics, including minority ethnic groups.
Thank you. How did the procurement process ensure that NHS test and trace services were integrated with secondary and social care providers, particularly those catering to ethnic minority patients?
So we engaged a lot, sort of, and I used to regularly engage with the devolved authorities, but also local government, and they were heavily involved in sort of the community testing once that sort of had moved from being mass testing to community testing. I can honestly say it wasn't sort of in my remit to sort of understand how we were targeting certain groups. But we did care a lot about the care sector, and particularly in care homes. So one of the first pilots we did was the sort of lab in a van, which went round care homes. Again, it was about increasing accessibility to vulnerable people to have access to sort of rapid testing. But I can't say if there was any sort of emphasis on going to those home providers, which were, had a larger demographic of those who are minority ethnic groups.
And my final question, how did government ensure compliance with public sector equality duty in procurement decisions related to test and trace? Can you say?
It's hard to say. I mean, we had really firm specifications for pretty much everything that we procured. So the sort of qualitative specification was the blueprint for what we had to buy. So I've got no visibility of how that was established to take into account equalities.
Thank you,
Mr. Dale. That completes our questioning for you. Thank you very much indeed. After working 18-hour days for so many months, I hope you got back to an ordinary sleep pattern, did you? It sounds like an awful burden on you.
It was quite a challenging period, but I mean, I would like to say that it was also quite incredible. There was a lot of positives about working in there. There was a lot of camaraderie, and people did amazing things. But I do want to say, I got quite emotionally attached to the programme. My husband's a consultant anaesthetist, so he was working really hard, and actually, when I could see the impact of what I was doing, the impact it has on him and his job, it was a really strong motivator, but it was difficult. But what I would say is, I've included lessons learned, but I think on reflection and seeing other evidence, I think there's a lot more. I'd happily share other thoughts, but I think there's things we could do to allow for preparedness that are pragmatic, because we haven't got a lot of money, so you can't just, I think we need to come up with recommendations that we can actually do but would have an impact, and I do have some thoughts on that.
If you'd like to send them in to the team, I'd be really grateful to receive them. And as you say, I've got to be really careful that when I make a recommendation, it's something that I can persuade the government that it is worth their while to spend precious resources on. So any thoughts along those lines will be gratefully received. Thank you very much for your help so far.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very well. That completes it for today, I think, Ms Gardner. Yes. I shall return Monday the 17th of March at 10:30. Thank you.